María, c'est à toi.
Empiezo. Buenos días. Gracias a todos y a todas por participar en esta conferencia sobre mujeres en sindicatos, construyendo poder y luchando por la seguridad. Todos los años, cuando se acerca el 25 de noviembre, reflexionamos sobre la situación de la violencia contra las mujeres, en especial las periodistas. Las diferentes crisis que vive el mundo, primero fue la financiera, luego la pandemia y ahora la energética, no solo ayudan a frenar los ataques contra las mujeres, sino que parecen acrecentarse. Las mujeres periodistas padecen en sus propias carnes todo lo que la violencia conlleva, insultos, amenazas y el riesgo a perder la salud o la vida. El Comité Directivo de la Federación Internacional de Periodistas ha querido este año poner énfasis en todo lo que tiene que ver con el ciberacoso. No es una preocupación nueva, pero es un gran problema para las compañeras periodistas y en especial para las que están menos protegidas por sus empresas o en sus países. Nuestra campaña No estás sola se debe hacer sentir una vez más. El Consejo de Género tiene una serie de prioridades para seguir avanzando en la igualdad entre hombres y mujeres periodistas y además ayudar a otras organizaciones sociales en la tarea de lograr un mundo más igual en el que se respeten los derechos humanos. En esta línea, luchar contra la violencia ejercida contra las mujeres es fundamental. Y un instrumento que nos parece importante es la aplicación del Convenio 190 de la Organización Internacional del Trabajo sobre el acoso en el mundo laboral. Quedan muchos países por ratificarlo y hay que lograr sobre todo el empujón final para que comience su aplicación, con todas las consecuencias. Vemos con preocupación el aumento del acoso contra las periodistas que se dedican al ámbito deportivo. Así, siguiendo con nuestra actuación, hemos enviado una carta al presidente de la FIFA antes del comienzo del Mundial de Fútbol de Qatar, para que se respete la libertad de prensa y los periodistas puedan ejercer su tarea. Hicimos lo mismo en las últimas Olimpiadas. En relación a la igualdad salarial, es una lucha en la que hay que seguir insistiendo. A nivel europeo se está trabajando por sacar adelante una nueva directiva. El Consejo de la Mujer de la Confederación Europea de Sindicatos, en el que participo, está muy activo y esperemos que se puedan lograr avances. Nos preocupa también que se avance en una mayor presencia de mujeres en los órganos directivos de la FIP y de las diferentes organizaciones que forman parte de la federación. Hay que felicitarse por haber logrado en Oman una directiva con mayor número de mujeres y por el hecho de que la presidenta del Consejo de Género forme parte de la misma. Habrá que insistir a los afiliados para que tomen ejemplo y cuenten con más mujeres en sus cúpulas. También nos gustaría que más mujeres estuvieran al frente de los medios de comunicación. Hay herramientas útiles como los planes de igualdad que, por ejemplo, en España son obligatorios para empresas con más de 50 empleados. Estoy segura de que muchas de estas cuestiones van a estar encima de la mesa en la conferencia de hoy, en la que tras la intervención de la presidenta de la FIP, Dominique Pradalí, se ha dividido en dos sesiones. La primera sobre el tema de la lucha contra la violencia en línea dirigida a mujeres periodistas. Será moderada por la vicepresidenta del Consejo de Género, Raida Guaita, y en la misma intervendrá Julie Possetti del Centro Internacional de Prensa, del Centro Internacional Periodista de Schilling, Michelle Stanistreet del Sindicato del Reino Unido, Heba Handil de la Fundación Thomson Reuters y una segunda sesión sobre hacia dónde van los sindicatos, hacia sindicatos de periodistas sensibles al género. En ella estará moderada por Patricia Axelsupo y intervendrán Concepción Oviedo, Maureno Dungan y Jenny Pillinger. Ahora, antes de que empecemos las dos sesiones, voy a hacer una breve presentación de Dominique Pradalí y le daría la palabra. Dominique Pradalí es una periodista y una sindicalista que ha trabajado sobre todo en la televisión pública francesa, en la RTF y en France Television, y ha sido redactora jefe del programa de Noticias de la Noche de France 2. Dominique ha estado ha sido secretaria general y portavoz de su sindicato, de SNJ, y ha sido elegida presidenta de la FIT en el congreso que hemos celebrado en Man en junio de este año. Sin más, paso la palabra a Dominique Pradali.
Merci beaucoup, Marie-Angélès. Bonjour à toutes et tous. J'espère que vous m'entendez. Je suis désolée, je n'ai pas pu mettre la vidéo, donc vous ne me verrez pas. Mais je voudrais saluer cette conférence et cette organisation et dire, voilà, une femme harcelée est une femme blessée, choquée et inquiète, souvent seule. Les femmes journalistes sont doublement victimes des agressions de toutes sortes, particulièrement en ligne. D'une part, en tant que journaliste, devenue cible privilégiée des aigris et mécontents de toutes sortes, ainsi que de toutes celles et ceux qui veulent les empêcher de témoigner et tentent de les faire taire. D'autre part, elles ne peuvent masquer leur identité puisque leur profession les amène à signer les articles et reportages de leur nom et à apparaître à l'écran. Devant la recrudescence des agressions de toutes sortes, la Fédération internationale des journalistes a effectué une première grande enquête en 2017. Des données inquiétantes, puisque dans les médias, près d'une femme sur deux a dû faire face à du harcèlement sexuel, des violences psychologiques, des abus en ligne et autres formes de violences basées sur le genre dans le cadre de son travail. Ces actes de violence ne visent pas seulement à intimider et à réduire au silence les femmes dans les médias, mais leur effet est paralysant. Ils contribuent également à les faire taire, à diminuer les sujets traités et ainsi à priver le public d'informations, affaiblissant le pluralisme et sapant le droit d'accès à l'information. Le harcèlement des femmes journalistes sur les réseaux sociaux et les sites web est devenu l'une de nos principales préoccupations. Il concerne toutes les femmes, peu importe leur origine politique, religieuse, ethnique. L'un des principaux aspects de ces attaques est qu'elles sont sexuées et sexualisées. Et force est de constater que les femmes issues de minorités ou de la communauté LGBTQ sont principalement visées par ces attaques. Quand on parle de harcèlement en ligne, l'une des difficultés auxquelles les femmes journalistes sont confrontées est le manque de soutien de la part de leurs confrères et de la part des rédactions. Le harcèlement en ligne fait en quelque sorte, je cite, partie du travail pour eux. Pour nous, au contraire, le harcèlement en ligne est un fléau qui doit être pris extrêmement au sérieux par les rédactions, mais aussi par les confrères et consoeurs journalistes. Est-ce la raison de la faiblesse des signalements et des plaintes déposées? En 2018, une enquête menée cette fois-ci aussi par l'IFJ a révélé que seulement 53% des victimes d'abus en ligne effectuaient un signalement à leur direction, leur syndicat ou la police. De toute façon, peu de résultats probants après ces signalements. Le harcèlement en ligne est une question de santé et de sécurité qui doit être considérée comme telle par l'industrie des médias. Les employeurs ont le devoir d'assurer à leurs employés un environnement de travail sécuritaire et doivent mettre en place un mécanisme solide permettant aux femmes journalistes de se manifester et d'être protégées lorsqu'elles sont la cible de cyberharcèlement. Nous avons développé, grâce à Pamela Morinière, que je tiens à remercier ici fortement, des lignes directrices pour aider les rédactions, mais aussi nos affiliés à réagir. Pour l'IFJ, l'une des solutions pour lutter contre le harcèlement en ligne, mais aussi toute forme de violence à l'encontre des femmes journalistes, est d'enjoindre les gouvernements à ratifier la Convention 190 de l'OIT sur la violence et le harcèlement au travail, qui s'attaque à la violence et à ce harcèlement sous toute forme, y compris en ligne. À ce jour, une vingtaine de pays dans le monde seulement ont ratifié cette convention. Nous verrons que les syndicats, notamment par le NUJ de Michel Stanistreet et par les syndicats français et autres, que des mesures ont été prises, mais ce n'est pas suffisant. Il nous faut aller avec toutes les forces disponibles, organisations de femmes, syndicats, associations, pour exiger cette ratification. Maintenant, à Oman, où j'ai été élue présidente, vous savez que la Fédération internationale, qui regroupe quelques 600 000 adhérente dans 150 pays, est organisée par région. Eh bien, la région Asie-Pacifique a vu mener à sa tête une femme, Sabina Inderjit. La région Amérique du Sud, je salue Zuliana Laïnes qui a été posée comme présidente de cette fédération. Et puis après Oman, la fédération européenne a vu une Croate, Maja Severs. Merci María-Ángel.
Sí, con lo mismo, muchas gracias, Dominique. Damos comienzo a la primera mesa redonda que la va a moderar la vicepresidenta del Consejo de Género, Raida.
Thank you, Maria. I hope you are hearing me. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Thank you very much. And I want to say to all, welcome to our first session of IFJ Gender Council Conference. Thank you for joining us. Hoping that we can provide a useful, important, and vital approach about fighting online violence against women journalists, especially with the participation of 3 distinguished panelists who represent the experiences of an important achievements in this issue. The Gender Council considers it necessary to develop journalists and journalist unions' capacity to counter online violence and to fight against the main obstacles affecting women journalists, including harassment, abuse, online trolling, and other forms of gender-based violence. So how we can open possibilities within and outside the IFJ Gender Council to develop online violence responses? How can we develop an extensive campaign at world level on this highly sensitive issue? No woman journalist should be facing alone online abuse. And finally, how can we help protect women journalists who work in exceptional situations such as wars and conflicts facing all kinds of violence? We are pleased to welcome our 3 panelists in our first session, and all 3 have been working on fighting online abuse. Julie Pusiti, Michelle Stanistreet, and Hiba Qandil, and I'll try to introduce them briefly. After that, in the next part of our session, we will run questions and answer. Let us start now with Julie Pusiti. She is a feminist journalist, author, and researcher, Deputy Vice President at Global Research. Julie is the co-author of the latest study, The Chilling, which is a global study of online violence against women journalists. It has been a long and difficult project. The Chilling, as Maria Ressa said, is a vital, at times gut-wrenching call to action. So, Julie, we are honored to have you here. You are more than welcome, and now talk to you.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you can all hear me. I'm stuck in a hotel room in London, not from my normal home in Oxford. So I'm glad to be with you regardless. And I think this is such an important issue for the union movement to tackle. So I'm especially pleased to be part of this conference. So I am going to try and share my screen because I'd like to share some statistics with you. And I think often it's easier to digest this information if you can see it as well. but unfortunately the host has disabled participant screen sharing, so I can't actually do that. So let me just talk to you instead about what we have done at the International Centre for Journalists in partnership with UNESCO over the past 3 years. So in 2019, UNESCO commissioned a study of 15 countries looking at the very complex issue of gender-based online violence against women journalists in 15 countries. And we began that research with a team of international researchers, including journalists in the field. Immediately after, we were commissioned to conduct this study, which we've called the chilling. The pandemic hit, which of course became a problem for us, both in terms of being able to conduct the research in person, but also in terms of this issue, the scourge of gender-based online violence affecting women journalists in a context where women journalists were locked in their homes for the most part, or isolated in other ways, but at the same time being forced to communicate digitally, which exposes them to increased risks of online violence. And so
Julie, you can share your screen now if you want.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much. I shall try and do that. And here we are. Okay, hopefully you can see this, and I'm just going to activate the slideshow mode.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So yes, this was the chilling. We started in 2019. The study has just concluded in November. In fact, we published the final book-length study, which is lengthy and detailed, which you can see there on the left of the screen. But during the course of this research period, working with over 20 colleagues internationally, we produced a snapshot in May on World Press Freedom Day in 2021, which summarized some of the key findings, but also laid out our theories around gender-based online violence. And importantly, in multiple languages, including Spanish, French, and Arabic. In December 2020, we published the first results from a global survey we produced as part of this study. So the methods that we applied were a survey of 1,000 journalists internationally, which was fielded by ICFJ and UNESCO. We had 714 women journalists responding to that survey. Then we interviewed over 180 journalists and experts in the area of online violence. And we also did in-depth country case studies. We did 15 of those for each of the countries selected. Finally, we produced what we called big data case studies, looking at the torrents of abuse directed at Maria Ressa, who needs no introduction, the Nobel laureate, and also Carol Cadwallader, who is a UK investigative journalist known to all of us, I'm sure. So we looked at 2.5 million social media posts, which we analysed with colleagues from the University of Sheffield, women computer scientists. So this was very much powered by women, this project. I think one of the really important statistics to share with you is this one, that 20% of the women surveyed said they had experienced online violence that they believed had led to offline harm in the form of offline abuse, attacks, or harassment. Now, this is a really striking and significant aspect of the evolution of gender-based online violence as it affects journalists. And this is something that we are now working to try to address, this trajectory from online to offline. At the same time, we think it's really important to acknowledge that while the physical manifestations of online violence should be treated very seriously, the psychological injury, and it is injury that is often experienced in a workplace context for women experiencing online violence, are very significant. So we can't downplay those at the same time as we need to think about how to respond effectively to these physical threats associated with online violence. So 25% of our women respondents, the journalists who participated in the survey, said that the most significant impact was actually psychological. Some of the other statistics that are important to note from this study, 73% of the women journalists we surveyed said they had experienced online violence in the course of their work, so while doing their journalism. 41% said that they had experienced online violence as part of what they believed to be an orchestrated disinformation campaign. So we really do see, particularly when state actors are involved or in organized campaigns of harassment, disinformation tactics being deployed and networked attacks being a feature of these assaults. Additionally, and this is something very important, I think, for the union movement to consider, whether at the country level or internationally, 37% of the women journalists pointed to political actors. So that was everyone from presidents and high office holders within the parliamentary system through to political party leaders and organisers. You know, these were identified as top perpetrators and instigators of online violence. So I think those statistics are well worth repeating. But back to this concern around the connection between online violence and offline harm, including right through to murder of women journalists and murder with impunity. I don't need to tell you that the public inquiry into Daphne Caruana Galizia's horrendous murder actually concluded that there was a direct connection between the online threats and harassment and abuse that she experienced in the online world with her eventual assassination. And what's important to note in her case, and this demonstrates just how prolific, invasive, and inescapable online violence is, Daphne was not even on social media, and yet she was being attacked and threatened in her absence within social media communities, notably Facebook. And we also have the situation with the murder of Gauri Lankesh in India, and the way that continues to be used as a situation to threaten the Indian investigative journalist and columnist Rana Ayub, who's one of the journalists' cases we've studied in detail. And she makes the really harrowing point that just before her friend Gauri Lankesh was murdered, they'd had a conversation on Facebook about online threats, and Gauri was trying to reassure Rana that this wasn't real, when in actual fact, of course, it's very real, and there are these correlations and connections with offline harm, and both Gauri and Daphne were, of course, killed at the end of 2017. So I think, you know, what is important is to take stock of the great knowledge resources we now have on this issue of online violence. And I would just like to make the point here that we made a deliberate choice to describe this as violence, taking cues from women activists who over the past decades have successfully campaigned to have psychological aspects of domestic violence, economic aspects of domestic violence, and digital aspects of domestic violence recognized as violence. Online violence, you know, is extremely real. Although it may not manifest in a physical way, it is real in the sense of its implications psychologically and in all of those other ways I have just mentioned. It is driving women out of online communities. It is silencing women. It's chilling their freedom of expression, specifically their press freedom. And as we saw in these big data case studies, which you'll find in the published study in detail, we just, we're able to experience for a moment by looking at this data what it's like to be at the center of an online violence storm, even if just as an observer, and it gives us some sense of the torrential nature and the, just the horrific, demeaning, dehumanizing, threatening, abusive language that is being used against women journalists online. And yet we are still hearing from the journalists we surveyed and interviewed that employers are not taking this problem seriously, and certainly not seriously enough. So only a quarter of the survey respondents had actually reported episodes of online violence to their employers, reflecting a lack of faith or a lack of trust or structural sexism that just prevents them from feeling able to explain that they are experiencing these threats. And that those situations were very clear, particularly in Carol Cadwallader's case. Okay, thank you. So I just want to highlight some of the content of the full report that was published this month. You will find in there, I think, a very useful chapter on what news organizations can do, which will hopefully also support the unions and associated organizations as they try to assist journalists working within news outlets, platforms and vectors. So thinking about social media companies, big tech, and the ways in which they have responded, or should I say, failed to respond effectively to this problem. We only have to look at the utter chaos and just regression that's happened at Twitter in the past month to realize just how urgent it is that there be appropriate rights respecting regulation of the social media platforms that actually facilitate this online violence, that does create an environment for the abuse, the lawfare, so the prosecution, persecution, incarceration of women journalists, and an environment where physical assault is also somewhat normalized. And then there are the legal and normative frameworks, which are important to note as well, the ways in which the law can be perhaps more effectively leveraged around the world. So the other thing we've provided is a tool. It's a 25-step process for states, but also organizations seeking to try to respond to this threat to women journalists in a way that respects freedom of expression. So this is also reflecting, the concerns that regulation undermines freedom of expression. Well, we've shown ways that you can actually address what we think is misogynistic hate speech in ways that do not undermine international human rights standards for freedom of expression. And we've made 107 recommendations for action. And I'm just going to stop now. I'm unaware of time because of the circumstances I'm in. I will stop by just sharing with you a screen grab of a system that we are currently working on with our colleagues at the University of Sheffield called, at this stage, the Online Violence Early Warning System. So we are trying to use massive data sets, having studied now 5 additional cases of women journalists, including Rana Ayub, Carmen Aristegui in Mexico, and Prada US, who is in Qatar. So we are developing a dashboard which will hopefully allow us to progress towards a system that provides alerts and points for escalation for organizations to respond more effectively to this problem. And I will leave it there and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Julie Positi, the journalist and researcher who grew up with a burning desire to change the world. It's very clear that she has made a great effort to achieve this. It was useful to introduce the finding of the chilling and the recommendation to find to fight online abuse. So thank you very much, and let us move to our second panelist, and the time allocated for each speaker is 10 minutes. Our second panelist is Michelle Stanistreet, National Union of Journalists General Secretary, and Michelle will present the NUJ safety application. So maybe we can know from her why the NUJ devised a toolkit offering practical tips to journalists to help protect them while doing their job. But is it acceptable for journalists to be threatened and abused just for doing their job? The answer will come to us from Michelle. Michelle Stanistreet worked as a journalist for 10 years at the Sunday Express newspaper, and a feature writer and a book editor. She was elected as General Secretary of the Union, and under her leadership, the Union has won landmark cases for equal pay in the industry. And working with the IFJ, she has been at the forefront of protecting journalists and freedom of speech across the globe. So, Michelle, you are more than welcome, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Raida, and thanks very much to the IFJ Gender Council for the invitation to come along and speak. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces and to be with you all this morning. I think, in my view, safety has become one of the most defining issues for journalists in a generation, and that's particularly the case for women. That makes it a defining issue for us as trade unionists and leaders of our unions. We know that impunity is a scourge right across the journalistic community globally, and it's one that the NUJ and many of you, all of our sister unions around the world, have been working very hard with the IFJ as part of our commitment to stamp that scourge out. And that's not just about our words, but it's what we do and our deeds. I think Julie's contribution and the global study outcomes make it absolutely clear the scale of the problem that we're facing. I won't repeat many of the statistics that the NUJ has been involved in research and studies with our members on, but they are very commensurate with the statistics that Julie's presented this morning. And we all experience these issues slightly differently, depending on where we live and the environments that our members are working in day to day. But safety in 2022 isn't just an issue in conflict zones or in regimes led by dictators and despots, or in places where organised crime is rife. It's absolutely a big issue for NUJ members and our journalists working right across the UK and Ireland, where we've seen a really concerning increase and spike in the number of cases involving our members, particularly over the last 2 years, with journalists increasingly being harassed and singled out for attack simply for doing their job. So our response as a union has very much been about prioritising the campaigning and the policy work that we've been doing on this important issue. And the kind of examples that I'm talking about are very diverse. We've seen repeated serious threats and harassment of journalists working in Northern Ireland, for example, where most of those emanate from so-called paramilitary groups who are keen to evade scrutiny about their criminality in communities there. We've seen countless incidents of photographers and reporters being shouted at, abused, chased, physically attacked on the streets whilst they've been covering demos and protests, especially through the COVID period. We've had many cases of far-right activists issuing death threats to journalists on social media, putting their home addresses and information on their families out into the public domain. something Julie mentioned about the first lockdown. One of the cases we had very early in the first lockdown in the UK was a woman reporter who works for a local newspaper who had to flee her home with her 6-year-old daughter after the police came to tell her there were credible threats against her life and against her daughter's life. And our research, and backed up by the research that we've been part of with the UK government, shows very clearly that women and Black and minority ethnic journalists are especially targeted. They face a double or a triple whammy as journalists trying to do their work. We've dealt with cases of women reporters who've been targeted with threats of rape and sexual violence, threats to be set on fire, to have their throats slit, threats to rape their young baby or maim their children. We've got different types of threats facing our members working for broadcasters in London based at BBC Persian Service and Iran International, where they're being absolutely targeted by Iranian state officials with their families in Tehran and the rest of Iran weaponized and harassed, and credible death threats and threats of being kidnapped on the streets of London have been issued just even in recent days. That's a very big problem for our members in those workplaces right now, work that we're engaged in as a union, along with the police, along with their employers, along with the IFJ. Typically, some of the threats that have been aimed at women journalists in those workplaces have absolutely focused on sexualized smears, accusations of them being prostitutes, threats to target their children here in London. I think it's also important to flag that this is an issue that's cutting across lots of different journalistic sectors and types of work in the industry. It's something absolutely happening to local newspaper reporters, as well as those journalists with higher national profiles who are on our TV screens or on radio each day. And it's absolutely behaviour that's designed to silence. And whilst a lot of that happens online, it also does spill out into real life stalking and harassment. And Julie's stats also back that up, involving perpetrators turning up in workplaces or even at journalists' homes. And it kind of creates that constant pressure as a backdrop to people's working lives. And it's that low level relentlessness of the abuse that many women journalists face every day, with many perpetrators hiding behind the cloak of online anonymity, to the most kind of odious threats that journalists then have to kind of worry about how seriously to take all of these. The sheer volume of some of this online harassment is incredibly pernicious. And when many of our members also have talked to us about the impact it has on their work, how it makes you check yourself before you post something on social media, how it makes you self-censor what you report on, what you write about. And most male reporters who've taken part in our research studies have always said, no matter how much abuse their own work might garner, it's never on the same scale as many of their female colleagues. Many of them, in looking at this as an issue, have been deeply shocked to realise the extent of harassment and abuse that their women colleagues working in the same newsrooms might be experiencing every single day. So some of the work that the NUJ has been doing has been about surveys and research and gathering data. It's also about representing individual members who've been attacked, threatened and harassed. We've been carrying out lots of work in conjunction with the government's National Committee for the Safety of Journalists. That was established formally in 2020 on the back of a lot of campaigning and lobbying that the union had done. Initially, the union was ignored in the creation of that safety committee by our government. So we had to fight hard to gain our rightful place on that committee, which we successfully did. And I wouldn't be being conceited in saying that since then, actually, it's been our contribution as a trade union that's led and directed most of the work that's been taking place alongside industry and employers, and practitioners and police and prosecutorial services and observers on that government committee, which is made up and hosted by 2 different government departments. It's also led to a bit of more positive movement in terms of some of the work that we're carrying out with industry and with employers, trying to develop workplace agreements to improve protections and policies that companies have been so slow to implement and to carry out in workplaces, as well as trying to make sure that it's not just their staff journalists that they're looking after, but it's also their freelance population of journalists, which for our union is a significant community of journalists. But I think a lot of the work, a lot of this issue boils down to changing the culture that journalists work in. So as well as trying to improve that support from industry and employers, it's been about trying to get police to better tackle complaints, to take them more seriously. It's about prosecutorial services clamping down on perpetrators and sending a robust message that this won't be tolerated. And so a lot of this work is starting to yield benefits. We've definitely made some improvements with the police approach to complaints that involve journalists, but fundamentally it's very much an ongoing work in progress that I think requires our constant vigilance and attention. We've heard lots about how journalists feel that they've just had to suck it up, that this abuse is just part of their job, that if they're feeling the strain, if they're finding it difficult, then somehow it's their fault, not least because the reality of much of this abuse is that it's at such a level and such a frequency that it's become normalised. So key to the NUJ's message has been that it's not normal. It shouldn't be part of anybody's job, and collectively we need to work to ensure such harassment and abuse is stamped out and not tolerated. That's why we launched a short film, and I can see my colleague Francis has posted some links in the chat. We launched a short film this month that shares testimony direct from some of our members. We're proud of it. It's very impactful and strong, and we hope it'll encourage the reporting of abuse and harassment by many more of our members and make journalists realise and see that this isn't something they should put up with. It's not part of their job. One of the committees, one of actions as well that we adopted, that we've led on along with the Society of Editors in the UK is a very practical one, the creation of the online journalist safety toolkit that was mentioned earlier. We also launched that this month. Basically, it's a progressive web app. So it's designed to be accessible and able to be downloaded and just sit there like any other app on your mobile phone. It contains lots of information and resources at hand to equip journalists with the tools to do their job safely, lots of links, lots of material and information about what they would need to do in the event of being abused, harassed, what to do with their employer, how to go about making a report to the police, what information to include, what service they should expect to get, how they can be in touch with the NUJ and be flagging their case and getting our help. So that's a resource, a very practical one that's going to be frequently updated, and we hope a useful source of information and guidance. As part of the government's committee, it's also being embraced and pushed by the employers as well, so not just from the union side. And that work sits alongside another suite of material we published a year ago now, which is the Story Smart suite of training modules and materials, which is aimed at reporters and photographers working in hostile environments and working amidst hazardous tech. So very much aimed at keeping our members, their sources and their journalistic materials safe. And I think that link that was mentioned earlier about the different forms that harassment and abuse and victimisation can take, it's really important that we also see the legal measures that are taken against journalists to try and thwart their work. So those, you know, the cynical pieces of law for the pieces of litigation that are designed to stymie a journalist's work and investigations. I think absolutely it's important we need to see that kind of behaviour as being a part of this wider violence and attacks on journalism and press freedom. And that's certainly the approach the NUJ has taken in our work against SLAP, strategic lawsuits against public participation, and other forms of litigation that many of our members have suffered at the hands of the rich and the thin-skinned. Before I finish, I was just going to flag as well the kind of dialogue that I've been having with colleagues in the States, in America, about the press freedom tracker that they have there, and also with colleagues in Canada who've been developing their own version. And that's been really helpful and useful to kind of find out about the work that happens in other parts of the world. And after all the work we've been doing as a union, I believe very strongly that an online database that can log and track incidents of harassment and abuse in real time may be a really valuable tool going forward, and potentially more effective from a union perspective than retrospective surveys we might be carrying out, or the government might be carrying out. Hopefully, if that's not something the National Safety Committee in the UK adopts, which it's likely it might, then it's something that the NUJ will look at launching its own version of press freedom tracker. And finally, I just wanted to pay tribute to the work and the leadership from the IFJ on this issue, which I think is also incredibly valuable and important, such as the kind of groundbreaking work bringing cases of killings and attacks on journalists in Palestine to the International Criminal Court, which the NUJ is supporting, the work that's been done on tackling impunity globally, or the direct help that we've had as a union in trying to combat Iran's targeting of journalists in London that I mentioned earlier, and putting that on the agenda of the UN and other countries. I think it's that kind of coordinated and collective work and approach that makes us all stronger and safer as journalists. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle Stanistreet, and we are fully confident that you are working and also enthusiastic to work more in a way that will reflect positively on women journalists all over the world. Now let's move to Hiba Kandil. We are curious to hear from Hiba about Thomson's TR filter campaign online abuse. And Hiba is a senior manager and media initiative in Thomson Reuters Foundation. She leads the design and development of key media development and initiative at Thomson Reuters to ensure TRF continues to provide innovative solutions that strengthen the resilience of free and independent media. She is also a trainer and spokesperson for the UN World Food Program. Hiba brings over 20 years of experience in journalism, communication, and media development. She has covered top news stories in the Middle East and North Africa. Plenty of stories. So Hiba, you are very welcome, and talk to you now.
Thank you very much, Reda, for this introduction, and it's such a pleasure and honor to be part of this panel with such wonderful women journalists and media freedom experts and expertise. I would like to share my screen as well, just to give a little bit about Thomson Reuters Foundation's activities and what we've been learning in this space. So I will request to share. And I hope everyone can see my screen.
Yes.
Wonderful. So I thought before we delved into some of the activities and initiatives, including TRF Filter, a product and a tool that we launched in collaboration with Google's Jigsaw, to give you just sort of an overview of how we got to this position and why we are contributing this. So a little about Thomson Reuters Foundation, for those of you who don't know. So Thomson Reuters Foundation is the corporate charity of Thomson Reuters, the global provider of news and information and financial statistics. As the corporate foundation, really our mission is to focusing on advancing media freedoms, fostering inclusive economies, and promoting human rights. And we do that using the twin engines of what we like to call journalism, the capacity building and the training that we provide all over the global south, and the law. We have the largest pro bono network called Trust Law, which connects the corporate charity work of big law firms and corporate lawyers with civil society and NGOs advocating for different thematics. And over the course of 40 years, we really have been working to bolster the ecosystem of independent media. And we do that oftentimes with collaboration with global partners such as the IFJ, UNESCO, the ICFJ, and more so. With our media freedom work, and this is the team that I currently work in, we have 3 pillars. And really, it's the middle pillar, as you can see, the defending media freedom is where we like to position this work that we're doing when we are creating positive environments for media to operate independently and safely. And what that means is we need to, to address one of the biggest concerns is the safety of journalists online, and disproportionately, those would be women. So really in June 2022, we partnered with Google's Jigsaw, who've offered their Perspective API to several partners, including Thomson Reuters Foundation, to work and to develop this tool to basically offer a shield of protection from toxicity and online violence to lots of journalists in this field, including women journalists. And what the tool does is actually it syncs with the Twitter account of a user, and it works with its API to detect and extract or filter out a lot of this toxicity and online violence. And then it allows users to document in bulk this online violence and campaigns. And again, the idea being is that to facilitate that process and to have this evidence to allow each user and newsroom to decide whether to escalate and how to escalate to the authorities or even internally. And when we've done that, when we've launched it in June 22, this really allowed us to speak and have these conversations with lots of stakeholders, with our journalists, mostly some of them are alumni, people who have graduated from our training programs and some of our newsroom programs, to see and hear and listen to what their experiences were. But also it allowed us to speak to many other stakeholders in this bigger ecosystem, including some leading news agencies, organizations, civil society, funders, lawyers. And again, because this issue, as we've heard from Julie and Michelle, it really is, we have to, in order to strategically offer some practical solutions, you need to take a look at it holistically. And much of what we've discovered is basically corresponds with the learnings and the findings in the research that is out there, including many insights from the Chilling report, which is we found that journalists were self-censoring due to online violence. It was taking a toll on their psychological well-being. They were considering to switch beats from investigative journalism, let's say, to something less controversial or deemed as more feminine, if we're talking and we're looking at this gender lens. And sadly, they reported that they were offered little organizational support when they did make the effort to report to their newsroom editors and their bureau chiefs. What this meant and the impact was, if more and more people, like, for example, Zanji Sinkala, one of our alumni from Zambia, an investigative journalist we spoke to, if less and less people, if more and more people, were self-censoring and depressed and thinking of switching beats, you have a decline in the overall number of high quality investigative stories produced by women and diverse journalists. Again, it's this gendered silencing, and it's moving decades and decades back into from what we've experienced. Sorry. Which leads to a decline in public awareness because if these stories aren't produced, and ultimately the outcome is a decline in power held to account, one of the outcomes. So from all these discussions that we've had and in seeking to develop the tool and seeking to really understand what more gaps are there that we can fill and that we can work with partners, we found that, again, it's nothing surprising. It corroborates all the evidence that has come out, is that journalists, especially in the Global South, shockingly, were oblivious. Many didn't even factor it as something that is different. They took it as part and parcel of the job. That's sadly what they were considering it as. We also zeroed in, interestingly, on the fact of the role of newsrooms. And again, it's a very natural area for us to focus on due to our connections and our linkages with Reuters, but also other newsrooms, that it is a safeguarding issue. What are newsrooms doing? There's so many toolkits and there's so many guidelines, and there's a lot of awareness, raising awareness, of course, to counter this culture and to counter this mindset, but also what's the organizational responsibility, so that we can avoid scenarios of journalists either taking themselves out of stories and producing reporting, or in an extreme, trying to file lawsuits against their employers for failing to adequately and effectively protect them. And also, it is a business issue. If we're looking at it from a very practical, if you're looking at it from the newsroom's point of view, or from any organization, if you have less and less women producing stories, or journalists in general, or shying away from those controversial news, it's an impact on your competitiveness and your productivity, and also a higher insurance risk. And so, in addition to TRF filter technological, and again, looking at it from an ecosystem point of view, from a holistic point of view, we've been sort of leveraging some of the positions and connections and ideas that we have in this field. So with the Media Freedom Coalition, a partnership of more than 51 countries, civil society, the UNESCO, and high-level legal experts working together to advocate for better media freedoms at home and abroad. Thomson Reuters Foundation is hosting the Secretariat of the Media Freedom Coalition, and really to provide that administrative and operational support to the MFC. And using those connections and learning and just being in that space, it just encourages us to extract even more learning to feed into the development of our programs, whether we're training journalists individually or with newsrooms. We last year, we also launched the Legal Network for Journalists at Risk, and it's also a network of lots of media freedom specialists and actors, including the IFJ, to sort of provide a network for a single entry for journalists and media workers to access the support, really leveraging and just better organizing the kind of different types of support legally that journalists require. And of course, we partnered with UNESCO and the IWMF and INSEE to produce several legal tools and practical guidelines on how to address gender-based violence in newsrooms, but also for, in general, online violence for journalists in general. And finally, last month, we convened at our annual Trust Conference a closed group on online safety, the risk for newsrooms. And this was a gathering of several different stakeholders across different sectors. So we had representatives from big tech, from small media startups, from big news organizations such as Reuters and the BBC and ITV, as well as media lawyers, to talk about what more can organizations do as newsrooms, basically, to get at the forefront, and so that journalists so far don't feel that all the initiatives and the solutions out there are shouldered on an individual's level, but actually there are more and more stakeholders at an organizational level, even at a policy level, shouldering that burden. And really, again, just to solidify the fact that we are looking at it holistically. So we are looking at different types of tools, TRF filter, but also other utilizing other types of technological solutions, such as providing VPNs to many of our journalists who are attending our training courses. And really focusing on solidifying the networks, developing more resources, and the convening. And finally, I mean, I applaud the chilling. It has been a seminal work, such amazing evidence that have been used and helped so many different stakeholders and organizations move forward with their own plans. So encouraging more of that kind of research. And again, the ideal situation where we want to end up with is that women like Zanji, women journalists, feel that they can take back control of their pen. They don't feel that as intimidated, and they feel that they're supported structurally in a system. And this is basically so far the journey and where we are right now. I'm going to stop sharing. I realize it's not the full 10 minutes, but I'm happy to give back some of those minutes to Q&A.
Thank you very much, Hiba, Qandil, and thank you for our 3 panelists for their participation and for the noble goals that they strive for. I think we are out of the time of our session. I don't know if we can run questions and answer. Famila?
No, I think we're running too late, unfortunately, but maybe in the second session, we'll have a bit of time.
Okay, thank you very much.
Damos paso, por tanto, a la segunda parte de nuestra conferencia. Gracias a las participantes en la primera conferencia, que yo creo que ha sido muy interesante. Nos ha puesto al día de lo que se está haciendo para avanzar en la lucha contra la violencia contra las mujeres periodistas. La segunda ronda hacia los sindicatos de periodistas sensibles al género va a estar moderada por Patricia y va a contar con la intervención de Concepción Oviedo, Maureen Dunga y Jan Fillinger. Cuando quieras, Patricia. Patricia.
Merci beaucoup,
Patricia.
Maria. Merci. Bonjour tout le monde. Comme Maria vient de le dire, justement, nous allons parler de cette thématique vers des syndicats de journalistes sensibles au genre. L'objectif de cette session est de fournir au public et à nous les journalistes et syndicats de journalistes des conseils et astuces utiles pour s'impliquer dans la campagne de ratification de la Convention 190 de l'OIT, violence et harcèlement au travail. Augmenter le nombre de membres féminins et renforcer l'autonomie des femmes dans les syndicats, prendre connaissance des bonnes pratiques des syndicats qui luttent contre la violence fondée sur le genre et de la manière dont elles renforcent l'autonomie des femmes dans les syndicats. Et pour notre panel, nous avons Conception qui va nous parler du travail de son syndicat contre le harcèlement à Paraguay, de l'effort pour avoir un leadership 50-50 et des changements à apporter au statut de son syndicat. Après, nous aurons Maureen qui parlera de la formation de la sécurité qu'elle a menée en Tanzanie, des défis que les femmes rencontrent pour protéger leur sécurité, expliquant les différents défis, y compris le harcèlement en ligne, et comment la transformation a encouragé les femmes à rejoindre les syndicats. Et notre troisième panéliste, c'est Jane, qui va nous parler de la convention de l'OIT. Et comme je vous le disais, c'est Concepción Oviedo qui va ouvrir notre panel. Concepción Oviedo, elle est journaliste, communicatrice institutionnelle, éducatrice populaire. Elle a un baccalauréat en sciences de la communication avec une spécialisation en études latino-américaines. Concepción occupe le poste de secrétaire à l'égalité des sexes du syndicat des journalistes paraguayens. De plus, elle est militante à l'organisation des femmes paysannes et autochtones Kunamuri, le collectif LGBTI via Campesinas et la marche mondiale des femmes. Pour ne pas trop tarder sur sa présentation, je laisse donc la place à notre consoeur Concepción Oviedo pour nous présenter sa thématique.
Explain to us, first of all, the first issue and the unions, what can we do against harassment?
Good morning, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here with you and to see you, even even if it's through a screen. I think that our realities are rather similar. As another journalist has mentioned during the first roundtable. What has been mentioned resonates with our situation in Paraguay. I wanted to share what our trade union in Paraguay is doing. I am a militant, but I come from a popular feminist background. I work with Via Campesina, and it has been said with the World March of Women. I wanted to explain that my participation has started with this invitation of a group of colleagues. They wanted to create a 50-50 list where we have a quota to, so I started helping them to build this trade union. So I come from the Gender Secretariat. We are creating our statutes now. So the Paraguayan Journalists Syndicate is working with a directorate that has a 50% women, 50% men, and we are also searching to include this in our statutes. So we are going to change our statutes to create this gender secretary, so it is permanent and we can reach equity in our trade union. I wanted to share the situation here in Paraguay, and I am sorry because I'm coughing. My throat is not cooperating this week. Well, in Paraguay, the situation can be framed in or can be defined as violence for women. Women journalists are there, and we do not speak up that much, but among colleagues, we communicate. Formal complaints are very complex. Canal 9 or Channel 9 is part of Albavisión. And in Albavisión, we've seen different cases of harassment, violence, and abuse. Our colleagues have never spoken up before, but this year, victims have come together and have filed a complaint. We as a trade union have accompanied these women because they didn't want to publicize it. But we accompanied them as trade unions and giving other spaces for women. And finally, in the end, our colleagues from this Albavisión group decided to speak up without giving up the identities of the victims to protect them. This, of course, created a commotion in the media. And the group said at first, well, we accept the complaint and we will do whatever we have to do. We, as trade union, we created also, we gave a statement to support our colleagues. Of course, there were tensions, there was fear, because we are speaking about people who are in charge of this media group. Carlos Granada is the journalist, and he he was in a leadership position, but thanks to our movement, thanks to our complaints and to our support, the Paraguayan prosecutors has condemned him. He is now in prison, and this is a historical moment for us women journalists to be able to speak up. The worst thing, though, is that he isn't the only abuser from the group. There are two other people who are in leadership positions and that are being protected by the institutions. There are some colleagues who have filed complaints against these two people. The group didn't accept the complaints and rather said, oh, go and mediate with them, try and find a solution with them. We rather find a solution behind the cameras. And some colleagues have been fired. Some colleagues are being persecuted. Some of them have had to renounce. So Albavision is living commotion times. Carlos Granada, sexual abuser, is right now in prison, and this is a win for us, an achievement, but this isn't definite. He's right now in preventive detention, but it gives an idea for other women. You are not invisible. In Paraguay, men usually occupy the leadership roles, and of course, this leads us to very toxic view towards women. We should study this issue. Today, our trade union is organizing a seminar where we will talk about best practices, harassment, virtual harassment, to continue our path. I mentioned the Albavision case because it's something that is completely new in Paraguay. And for us, women journalists, this is very important. It gives us a light to learn how to accompany women, how to work together, and how to protect them, to continue being in the anonymity. Of course, we have never shared names. We have publicized our statements, and we've always been there for them. We've accompanied them to meetings, to other places, to be able to help them and to be there to listen to them. We must learn from other best practices, from organizations, institutions that are already working to help women. This kind of violence is, of course, a cross-cutting issue. And we are going to celebrate on the 25th of November, a very important day. So from our spaces, I only have 1 minute. I know, sorry. So as I said, from our organizational space, we should continue working together with other countries to be able to communicate, to share information. That way we can exchange practices and build power. And it will also help us to reflect on how to accompany our colleagues. Of course, every reality is different, and every woman must be protected within their work. media and organizations are very strong and where women are persecuted, we must denounce. Otherwise, we will have a problem. Men who hold power protect each other, of course. So trade unions and other spaces are very important to protect us and to share information, as I said, to exchange best practices, to be stronger, to fight against violence. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à Conception pour la présentation qu'elle vient de nous faire.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this speech. Really very important presentation. Realities are very similar as journalists, whatever the country. And the next speaker is going to speak of the commitment of these journalists who are arrested, and they are going to say how we could support and be by the side of these arrested journalists. What is being expressed now is certainly very difficult to speak up now. And nevertheless, it's fantastic to discover that some of those victims are speaking up. And little by little, other authors, perpetrators are being imprisoned. And this is certainly new. This certainly must encourage us to support each other, to help each other. Thank you to Concepcion. And now we are going to move on to Maureen Odunga from Tanzania. She's a journalist in Tanzania.
Standard newspaper, et elle est formatrice sur les aspects des questions de genre et de sécurité dans les médias. Elle poursuit actuellement une maîtrise. Diplômée en recherche et politique publique à l'Université de Dar es Salaam et en tant que titulaire un baccalauréat en relations publiques et publicité de la même université, le soutien du syndicat, grâce au soutien du syndicat norvégien des journalistes, elle a formé également des journalistes. Je ne vais pas trop m'attarder sur sa biographie, mais nous allons plutôt l'écouter pour nous présenter son thème. Merci beaucoup. Maureen, vous avez la parole. Merci.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you, everybody. Maybe briefly to talk about my union, which is the Journalist Workers Union of Tanzania. The union is still in infant stage because it was formerly the former union that existed in Tanzania was being deregistered due to not meeting some of the law requirements. So we had to revive the union, and later on, so we obtained our registration in 2018, March, and now we have about we have over 400 members, and mostly about 70% of the members are female journalists from Tanzania. So coming to what I'm supposed to be speaking about, the safety aspect, talking about safety and the journalism profession in Tanzania, specifically for women. Tanzanian situation is not very different from other countries, but our situation is a bit complex because of the composition of the media houses here. Most of the females, most of the journalists in Tanzania, both female and male, work as mainly correspondent and freelance journalists. So these journalists, they work in very hostile environment because some of them, even as they work as correspondent, they work without contracts, or they sometimes even those who have contracts, they go without pay for 1, 2 to even more than 3 months. So we can say that journalists in Tanzania, they face a very difficult situation, both female and male. But basically, about the trainings, now Jowuta was some years back after we went to a training in Senegal in 2017 and got an opportunity to conduct trainings on safety and gender equality. This was through the support of the Norwegian Union of Journalists, and we have been able to 23 trainings on safety and gender issues. And in these trainings have been carried out in the 26, in the of Tanzania, out of 26 regions. So in these trainings that we have carried out, we have come to find out or discover that female journalists in Tanzania face a lot of problems. First is the issue of sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is very, very common in most of the media houses, even those females that do not operate in media, media houses, those that represent their organizations in the regions also come accustomed to sexual harassment, simply because like I said before, that most of the journalists work without contracts. So the modality that these journalists obtain placement in these newsrooms is that maybe a journalist can communicate with the editor of a certain media house and request to write or broadcast news for that media house. So these ones often cases cause the journalists not to have a proper contract or any sort of agreement on whether they'll be paid or not, which exposes them to a lot of dangers. So these journalists basically rely on the sources for their daily earnings, upkeeps, and even transportation. So it's sometimes on reporting stories, they may even face a lot of danger because it's their sources that they rely on. So they receive a lot of advances from the male sources, sometimes also from these editors that they request to write for their organization. So sexual harassment is among the most common issue that faces faces female journalists in Tanzania, putting the females in a lot of danger. Again, regarding the training also came about to learn that since these journalists in Tanzania, they are not paid, they don't have contracts, they are not paid well, they don't get any sort of remunerations. So they don't even have pension, they are not enrolled into any pension schemes. So this put them in greater risks, because even once they retire or they are sick, they don't have anywhere to rely on, because they don't have health insurances. So even when they report stories in risk or dangerous environments, there's no one that can cover their health insurances. It's them, the journalists themselves, pick something from their pockets to help their counterparts in order to get treatment for the dangers they have been exposed to. So it's very risky. It's a risky environment that journalists operate in Tanzania, because their safety or security is not usually guaranteed by the media outlets that they work in, because of those facing lack of contracts. So like I've highlighted that the challenges that which face journalists is the same challenges that the female
journalists mostly face, but in the case of female journalists also, sometimes they are bosses. I mean, these male bosses, they usually ask for sexual favors from the female journalists. So also it places the female journalist into greater risks. And speaking about whether this, we were trying to, the Journalist Workers Union now, since the government in 2016 was trying it introduced a new law, which is it's called the Media Service Act of 2016. But within the law, it stipulated that that the minimum qualification of journalists to operate in Tanzania, they should have at least a minimum diploma now, because we have an influx of journalists coming into the profession because they see that it is the only easy way that they can get something, to get some sort of something to do, either a job or something, because there's no sort of regulation that govern the profession, that we need, maybe it's only those people with diploma in journalism, or maybe a degree, or some sort of requirements. Now the government had intervened and came up with that law, which brought a lot of, it was widely contested by most of the veteran journalists and some of the journalists that have worked in the profession for a long time, that how can they be bringing such law, which will bring all the experienced people and leaving out, waiving all the experienced people out of the profession. So the profession will be left out with only junior journalists who maybe have degrees or diplomas. So it was widely contested to the extent that they gave a 5 years grace period, which had expired last year, because the minister that is actually in power right now, he tried to come he met with journalists, some of the journalists and some of the media associations that govern for the rights of journalists in Tanzania. And the journalists requested the minister that the law should not go into force, simply because it would put out a lot of experienced veteran journalists from the profession. So they were trying to discuss and come up with a solution on how to handle the situation. But for us now, Jouta was thinking that maybe the law would become as a savior to most of the journalists, because it would regulate the way. Yes.
Maureen?
Yes.
1 minute.
It would regulate the way the journalists are being recruited, and maybe it would bring sanity and promote the welfare of journalists, whereby even the safety would be guaranteed, as they would have a pay and will get this all health insurances. Yes, and again, speaking about how the trainings they have been encouraging women to join the union. Like I said before, that 70% of our members are with female journalists, and most of them, they have been coined from these trainings that we have carried out in more than 20 regions in the country. Thank you very much. Yes. Yes, thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à notre consoeur Maureen. Maureen qui nous a quand même montré que la situation n'est pas la même dans des pays. Dans son pays, en Tanzanie, bien sûr, des journalistes qui travaillent sans contrat. Des formations ont été organisées à l'endroit des journalistes femmes pour leur sécurité. Étant donné que des journalistes n'ont pas de contrat, il y a quand même eu dernièrement des conditions ou bien des lois qui ont été votées par le gouvernement pour quand même réguler le métier. mais il faut pas perdre de vue que cette décision a heurté des réactions des syndicats de journalistes, comme quoi on ne peut pas limiter le métier de journaliste à ceux qui ont seulement des diplômes, mais on n'a pas forcément besoin de diplôme pour faire le travail, mais il faut quand même reconnaître qu'il y a un bémol, à ça. Et Maureen a fait des formations dans son pays et elle a au moins couvert 26 régions, si je me trompe. Je ne vais pas trop aller dans les détails parce que nous avons des questions à poser. Maureen, merci beaucoup. Nous allons maintenant nous retourner vers notre sœur Jeanne Pininga. Jeanne Pininga qui va nous parler de la Convention de l'OIT. Et Jeanne Pininga est une experte mondiale sur l'égalité des sexes et la violence sexiste au travail. Travaillant avec des syndicats nationaux et mondiaux, l'OIT et ONIFAM. Elle a eu une formation académique, Jeanne a eu une formation académique dans la politique sociale et en tant que militante pour mettre fin à la violence sexiste depuis plus de 35 ans. Jeanne est une co-auteure d'un livre publié par Agenda Publishing en 2022 avec Robin Bunger et Shidi King. Mettre fin à la violence et au harcèlement fondé sur le genre dans le monde du travail, la campagne de l'OIT. Nous allons suivre notre consoeur, notre aînée, notre sœur, Jeanne, qui va nous parler de cette convention de l'OIT. Jeanne, vous avez le micro. Merci.
Thank you, Patricia. Can you hear me okay? So thanks, Patricia, and many thanks also, Pamela, for the invitation to speak at this really interesting and important conference. I'm going to talk particularly about the campaign for Convention 190 and why it's a really important tool for the prevention of violence and harassment in the world of work. For those of you, for the background, the ILO Convention 190 and accompanying recommendation number 206 were adopted by an overwhelming majority of workers, employers and governments across the world at the International Labour Conference in 2019. And for those of you that are not so familiar with the International Labour Organization, it's a UN agency, but it's the only UN agency that is a tripartite constituency comprised of governments, workers and employers. And it's, you know, it was really, really a fantastic campaign that was carried out by women in the unions to get the adoption of this really landmark treaty. It's groundbreaking. It sets out international standards to both prevent and respond to violence and harassment, including a very, very strong focus on gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work. And the reason that I wanted to mention this as a starting point, because it is really critical to ensure the safety of journalists. And it's really interesting to hear what Maureen was saying in Tanzania about the importance of these safety measures, because we know that women journalists regularly experience some of the highest levels of online abuse, of threats, harassment, and where we've seen increasing levels of physical violence and indeed murders of women journalists. And I know that the IFJ has campaigned around this culture of impunity. And we've seen figures coming from surveys saying that, you know, as many as 65% of all journalists, women journalists, have experienced some form of violence at work in their, you know, workplaces, in their newsrooms, in their homes, on the way to and from work. So, and we know that the reality is that we need strong laws to stop this, but we also need to ensure that both employers and unions are able to negotiate workplace measures and collective bargaining agreements to ensure that there's a zero tolerance towards violence and harassment. We need to be changing behaviour. We need to be building cultures of respect and hope. And we need to also, you know, do this in the trade union movement through collective bargaining and the development of strong workplace policies that put obligations on employers. And in a way, you know, this is where Convention 190 is really important, because it gives us a framework for this. Particularly, and I think, you know, this is the case for women in public facing roles, particularly where women are outspoken, where they may be challenging the patriarchy, where there's frequently a culture of impunity. It's really important that we change the voice of women to enable women to safely speak out. And it was really interesting just hearing from Conception's presentation just now about how this culture of online abuse and threats actually silences women journalists and particularly feminists. And this is something I can relate to as for myself as somebody who writes regularly about gender-based violence and harassment. That the culture of online abuse has been growing in recent years, and I think for many of us working in the field of kind of public-facing services, this culture of what we call third-party violence and harassment has become even worse. And one thing that's really important, I think, as well, is that we see a culture of impunity running through journalism, from popularist press that is silencing women journalists, keeping them out. And this culture of impunity extends into the right-wing media, and often we see the stereotyping and the demonizing of women who dare to speak out. So what we did in our book, Stopping Gender-Based Violence in the World of Work, we documented the campaign for Convention 190, the process of negotiations in the ILO, and also the campaign for ratification. And as many of you know, it has been a remarkable campaign. And it was really built around union organizing and union women organizing around violence and harassment. First of all, it was women workers who fought for this integrated approach to violence and harassment that we see in the convention, covering all workers, named as unacceptable behaviors related to physical, sexual, or economic harm, but also with this very strong focus on gender-based violence and harassment. And the second thing that we documented in the book was that really it was the groups who are the most disproportionately affected by violence and harassment are named. It was those that were involved in the campaign, the women working in the most precarious of employment situations, that were directly at the forefront of the campaign. And one thing that they fought for during the negotiations and during the campaign for ratification is that this covers all employees. And this is one of the groundbreaking parts of the convention. It covers all employees regardless of their contractual status. So it can apply to informal workers, workers on precarious contracts, also workers who are subject to sexual harassment and sexual favors during the recruitment process, to work-related social events, importantly, in the context also of the pandemic, the rising levels of what we have seen of third-party violence and harassment against journalists, against the growth of what we can see of online abuse threats and cyber harassment and abuse. So what's really good about the convention also is that it does cover this kind of broad concept of the world of work. It's not just about the conventional workplace. It can include travel to and from work, and that's really important. It includes all of those workplaces that can include the home, the formal office workplace, but also covers work-related communications. And then the other thing just to say about the convention that the women workers fought for, and we've also documented in the book, is the way that social dialogue is actually woven through the convention and the recommendation. And this has been a real triumph at a time of backlash against, what we've seen, the backlash in recent years against union involvement and representation and organizing. Just to come back to the convention, it is binding on parties that ratify the convention. It's addressed towards governments, and so far 21 countries have ratified the convention. And in fact, I was involved in helping the ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation, draw up its survey that was just published just recently. on gender-based violence. You can get it off the ITUC's website if you're interested in the results of the survey. But what the survey found was that actually up to 50 countries are likely to ratify the convention by the end of 2023. So this is really good news. But the survey also found that 28 countries responding to the survey said that there was no indication yet that their governments will ratify the convention. So that also is really important, to be fighting for the ratification in those governments and using the framework of Convention 190, using it as our basis as a blueprint for our collective bargaining, regardless of whether it is ratified or not. So in terms of the campaign, I'll just say a few words about the campaign for those of you not so familiar with it. Although I think it touched and reached women in all corners of the world, in all sectors, including women in some of the most precarious situations. The campaign for ratification.
2 minutes.
Okay, great.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay, d'accord. So the campaign has had a really big impact at the national level. And the International Federation of Journalists has been involved with other global unions in this campaign. In terms of, what we've seen in relation to rising levels of violence and harassment, the campaign has really reached out to address these issues about online abuse, on recent increases in domestic violence, particularly, and just to note that the convention and the recommendation do cover domestic violence as a workplace issue. And this was down to the campaigning of the trade unions that we managed to get this into the treaty. So it's hugely important that domestic violence is now recognized as a form of workplace violence when it impacts the workplace. So, I could say more about this, but just to sum up in my last 30 seconds, what can unions do? First of all, we want unions to be campaigning continuously for the ratification of Convention 190. But once those countries have ratified, it's really important that we ensure that the laws of the land are in line with and aligned to the convention. And this means bringing into alignment your occupational safety and health laws. So it includes things like risk assessment from a gender-based perspective, of putting obligations on the employers to draw up workplace policies to address risks associated with power inequalities, and so on. Third, to make sure that in the future, our collective bargaining agreements, whether there is ratification or not, that our collective bargaining agreements are aligned with the convention and recommendation 206. And to ensure that this alignment really uses, the blueprint, in a way we've argued that there's a guide to using ILO Convention 190 that we produced for the ILO Workers Group, ACTRAV, which sets out some of the ways that unions can use the framework of Convention 190 in their collective bargaining. And this is really, it adds obviously resonance if there is already ratification having taken place. But even there's a lot of unions already, and we've collected more than 200 examples of collective agreements across the world where unions are already using the language and blueprint of Convention 190. So many thanks to all of you. I'm very happy to give more information about Convention 190 for anybody that wants further information. But back over to you, Patricia. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Jane. Merci beaucoup pour la présentation. C'est vrai que c'est intéressant à un moment donné, mais le temps nous talonne. Et je rappelle que Jane nous a parlé de cette campagne de la Convention 190 de l'OIT. La Convention 190 de l'OIT qui demande à ce que cette Convention 190 sur la violence et le harcèlement. Et elle a entamé sa présentation en nous faisant savoir que près de 55% de femmes ont été victimes de harcèlement sur les lieux de travail. Maintenant, comment venir à bout de ces situations quand on sait que dans nos différents pays, on n'arrive pas à dénoncer ces situations-là. Donc, elle a exhorté à ce que cette convention 190 soit ratifiée. Et qui va ratifier cette convention? C'est une exhortation qui est faite donc à toutes les organisations syndicales de s'impliquer, de s'y atteler pour pouvoir amener les autorités de leur pays ou bien les décideurs à signer cette convention 190. De l'autre côté, elle a également touché du doigt de cette obligation qui est faite aux employeurs à mettre en exergue dans leur rédaction et autres cette question de genre. Et pour terminer, elle a exhorté à la signature de la convention collective. Nous savons que c'est cette convention collective qui protège les employés sur les lieux de travail dans l'exercice de leur métier. Donc, elle a exhorté également à ce que cette convention collective soit signée dans nos différents pays. Merci beaucoup. Merci à Jane. Merci également à vous, chers confrères, chers consoeurs, pour l'attention particulière. Je crois que nous avons, à présent, nous allons à présent peut-être procéder aux questions-réponses. Vous n'êtes pas sans savoir que nous avions laissé le premier panel, ce qui voudra dire que pour cette présentation, ce sera les deux panels.
Creo que podíamos hacer las preguntas sobre las dos sesiones, pero por favor que sean preguntas cortas para que nos permitan tener la máxima participación. ¿Alguien quiere preguntar algo? Tal vez podríamos hacer un resumen de lo que ha sido la conferencia, si os parece. Yo creo que hay dos cuestiones claras que yo avanzaba cuando hemos hecho la presentación. La primera, que el tema de la violencia de género contra las mujeres periodistas sigue estando de actualidad, que las últimas crisis y las actuales que vivimos acrecientan estas situaciones y que para ello tenemos una serie de herramientas importantes. Todo lo que ha trabajado la NUC nos parece especialmente interesante. Poder contar con bases de datos de los casos de mujeres que han sufrido acoso sería algo súper importante y yo creo que todos los sindicatos deberíamos intentar que en las plataformas, que hubiera plataformas nacionales que estuvieran conectadas, y yo creo que el Consejo de Género es un buen punto de coordinación de estos esfuerzos, por supuesto, de acuerdo con otras organizaciones internacionales. El convenio 190, como venimos repitiendo en nuestras campañas, nos parece fundamental. En el caso de España ya está ratificado, pero todavía no está en aplicación, pero nos parece muy importante y de hecho en muchos convenios colectivos se está empezando a recoger teniendo en cuenta los planes de igualdad que antes hemos comentado. Evidentemente la precariedad laboral que algunas de las ponentes han comentado nos preocupa y mucho, porque si la seguridad de las periodistas es muchas veces precaria, más lo es cuando no tienen un apoyo laboral o cuando pueden perder su incluso precario trabajo si denuncian casos de acoso. Yo creo que lo que nos debe llevar es que los sindicatos tenemos que seguir luchando para evitar esta violencia de género, que también contra la impunidad, para que los casos que se comprueben no queden sin castigo, y la batalla va a ser muy dura y no deberíamos centrarnos solo, aunque es lo habitual, pero centrarnos solo el 25 de noviembre, sino que fuera una campaña continuada, y desde el Consejo de Género yo creo que es uno de nuestros principales esfuerzos. Tenemos poco tiempo, pero por favor, si tenéis preguntas, las podéis hacer ya.
Maria Angeles, if I may, there are questions in the chat. There are two questions in the chat. One is about the countries that have ratified C190. So I guess that's a question for Jane. And then we have a question from Concepcion in Spanish in the chat, who wants to know what was the process for getting so many women in Tanzania, in the union in Tanzania.
Y luego ha levantado la mano Auda.
Oui, bonjour. Merci beaucoup pour ces superbes interventions. Ma question, elle est à Julie Posetti. En fait, c'est moins une question qu'une petite remarque. Les hommes ne sont pas associés à cette enquête. Est-ce qu'il ne serait pas intéressant, peut-être, d'avoir, enfin, je ne sais pas, j'imagine qu'il y a des hommes témoins de violences et qui pourraient éventuellement être associés, je sais pas. Voilà, merci.
So like I said before, there's a question that what was the process of getting many women in Tanzania? I simply said that the union, the trainings that we have organized on relating to safety and gender also was advocating for, I mean, encouraging women to join the union so that they can be, we can be able to advocate for their rights. Also, the training acted as an eye opener to them because a lot of issues that were posed in the trainings acted like something new to them. So the training was opening them up, and so they thought that it was wise for them to enroll to the union. Maybe it's a way out of the many existing challenges that face female journalists in Tanzania. That's the main factor that we managed to accumulate many women as members of the union in Tanzania. Thank you.
Beatriz Pérez había pedido la palabra. Beatriz.
Sí, gracias. Estoy de acuerdo con
Beatriz.
María Ángeles. Sí, estoy totalmente de acuerdo. Estoy de acuerdo con María Ángeles en general de que las campañas. Sí, estoy de acuerdo con que no deben ser una
¿Dónde han
semana
compartido
ni un mes.
también lo de los países?
Es de
Beatriz, ¿puedes hablar?
Sí, claro, gracias. Estoy de acuerdo que no puede ser una semana, ni un mes,
pues
ni
yo
un
no
día.
Lo oigo.
¿No lo oyes?
Yo
Tengo
lo
el
oigo.
micrófono abierto. Lo tengo abierto. Está abierto mi micrófono. ¿Está cerrado allá?
Pues yo no lo oigo.
¿No lo escuchas?
We can hear you, Beatriz.
María Ángeles, ¿escuchas? En ese caso, haré mis preguntas por el chat. Gracias.
Ah, de acuerdo. Sí.
Okay.
Gracias.
Okay.
Je crois qu'il n'y a pas d'autres questions. Maria? Il n'y a pas d'autres questions.
De acuerdo. Entonces yo creo que hemos completado la hora. Muchísimas gracias a todos los que habéis participado, a las ponentes, a las que han preguntado, a la organización que ha coordinado Pamela y por supuesto a los traductoras que nos aguantáis nuestros problemas técnicos en muchas ocasiones. Creo que la principal conclusión es esa, que la tarea que tenemos por delante es muy importante, que todas las organizaciones debemos implicarnos y que las mujeres periodistas tenemos que estar al frente para lograr que la igualdad entre hombres y mujeres sea cada vez una realidad más concreta. Muchas gracias y seguimos peleando por la igualdad de todos. Gracias.
Can I just ask before everyone goes back, can we take a group photo? Because it's so rare to have everyone here, and I know there are plenty of Gender Council members, and thank you everyone for joining. It's so great to see you all there. Could you all turn on your camera so that we can do a group picture as a souvenir before we go? Are you ready? Smile. Thank you. Have a nice day. Thank you to the moderators for their excellent work. Thank you to Dominique Pradali as well for joining. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.